Hi, welcome. I'm Paul Carrigan, and here with poet and translator Emily Jungmin Yoon, author of A Cruelty Special to Our Species, and translator of the book she's agreed to talk with me about today, Against Healing, 9 Korean Poets, which is just brand new out as part of a series of translating feminisms. Emily, thanks for talking with me.
Thank you for having me.
My first question is what's the backstory on this book? How did this come into being?
Well, I have been translating for a while, so I've published translated poems here and there, but I hadn't done a whole book. And I met Deborah Smith, Tilted Access Press, a while ago, and she reached out to me saying that they're doing this translating feminism chapbook series, and asked me if I'd be interested in doing the Korean poetry part. So I said yes, and yeah, it's been quite a journey. I went through a lot of books to find the poems that I want to translate, and there are, I think, 9 poets in here that I translated. So that was many books, but it was a very fulfilling process. I learned a lot from taking on this project as well. So.
In the preface to the book, you say that not all of the poets will necessarily consider themselves feminists, because the word feminist doesn't translate very well into Korean, but that you consider them feminists. So you say, my reading that their writings are feminist for boldly speaking in voices and of topics commonly regarded as unbecoming or inappropriate for women, but are truthful to their experiences and convictions. And I think that's a fascinating definition of feminism, that is taboo and true. I wonder if you might say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I have to say that I don't know if all the poets here self-identify as feminist, because feminism is such a contested word in Korea, and I think it has different meanings. Because I think partly it's because of the language of it. In English words that's been transliterated into feminism into Korea, and I think sometimes when it's not transliterated, translated, it's people use the word 여성주의, which means women centricism, which I don't think is necessarily the meaning of feminism, as I understand it. So I had to put it in there. I didn't want to claim that they themselves have owned that moniker, but I do think that their poems they lend themselves to feminist readings and reading experiences, because I think a lot of the themes in these poems are like unseemly things or ugly things, and written in language that have traditionally been not considered feminine. And the history of feminine writing and feminine poetry in Korea are interesting as well. And women poets have pushed against the traditional norms of what it means to be, writing in a feminine voice, and they have subverted that, in their language, in their themes, in the subject matter. And I do think that the contemporary poets that I've included in here are pushing against ideas about feminine writing that even some people have today. So.
The title of your book, Against Healing, is interesting, because who would be against healing? And same preface, you explain that. You say these women are, in my opinion, not interested in the function of poetry to heal, it is to hurt. They write to acknowledge and declare their pain. So I'm wondering, is this against healing altogether? Is it against healing that is too soon and too superficial because you haven't really acknowledged the pain. What I wonder if you might say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I think that, I'm still like making some assumptions here about like how poetry is perceived in the popular imaginary, right? But I think the poets that I chose for this collection are kind of actively against seeing poetry as like some kind of channel for relief, a resolution, a beautiful space where like, the realities of the world kind of stop, and then you fall into this reverie. I think they're very actively against poetry's function as just that. And I think they're using poetry to really lay bare the pains that they suffer, personally, but also they're connecting it on like a societal level, and really seeing poetry as like a site of movement. I think that's my extrapolation, right? Like I haven't included any like critical writings in here, but I do see women's poetry as a site of movement in which to profess their identities, and using poetry as a space in which they can imagine, right? Imagine these voices and let them thrive. So that's what I meant by against healing. And I think it's kind of a strong title. Maybe I don't want to say they're against healing in general. That women have to suffer forever. I don't mean to suggest that, but I do think that they are pushing against how Korean society, up till the contemporary moment, has seen women's poetry as.
So I'm sadly monolingual. So my next question comes from that ignorance, ignorance of the what it's like to know more than one language. So how would you describe your relationship to English and to Korean? Do you know one language better than the other? Do you love them one better than the other? Or is your to one language than the other?
Yeah, I think. Well, so I'm a native Korean speaker, and I acquired English kind of later in my life, I guess. Well, it sounds weird, but I started, learning how to speak English really when I was around 11. So that was, after I had gone to elementary school in Korea, and had really only spoken Korean with my family. I mean, I only still speak Korean with my family. But I realized that certain things are easier in Korean and certain things are easier in English. And writing definitely is easier in English if it's poetry, and if it's like academic writing. And that's because of my training, right? I came to poetry really I came to consider poetry as um, my career, or something that I'm doing um, with a kind of seriousness that was different from when I was just writing short stories all the time when I was a baby. Um, I came to that when I was living in Canada, and I was taking writing classes in English. So I mean that's the same with writing papers too, right? I of course went to Anglophone school, so I didn't grow up writing papers in Korean. So I think I have a better grasp of scholarly language in English and my own poetic rhythm in English. But when I'm writing just I don't know, nothing really that important, when I'm just chatting with my friends or maybe writing a blog post or whatever, Korean works as well. And when I'm like in daily communication, I feel like I can speak both with ease. Yeah, but anything that requires specific training, I found that it's English that's easier, since that's just the background that I come from, the academic educational background that I come from. Yeah, but I think I've said this before in other avenues where I talk about my poetry as opposed to my translation. I do think that learning or having been a Korean speaker has made my English richer. And I think that I do think that in translation it shows, and translation helps with my poetic practices because knowing Korean or knowing Korean words for something, knowing how to notice and observe things in Korean lends me this kind of sensitivity to language, this observational acuity. Um, like, for example, there are some things that, like maybe even idioms that are in Korean but don't have an equivalent in English. And then in that translational process, I think about, why do we describe things that way? Or what are the words we use to describe the situation? So it gives me more tools to use language, I think. And hopefully that goes into my translations as well, not only my poetry.
I was talking the other day to the poet Ravi Shankar about
Mhm.
anthology he co-edited, Language for a New Century. And he was describing how he and his co-editors had some trouble finding Arabic poems in translation to include because, as he described it, and I'm maybe doing a bad job paraphrasing him, but in Arabic poetry, the style favors very flowery and almost sappy language, which sounds beautiful in Arabic, but then when translated into English, that's kind of not what the predominant taste is for English language poetry. So
Mm.
I was curious if anything you ran into anything like that translating in from Korean to English, where maybe it didn't quite work as well, or if there was a tension between kind of reproducing the experience of the language in English and Korean accurately versus making a good poem in English.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I think I've encountered Korean poems that I think are absolutely beautiful, and I try translating it into English in my head, and it just completely falls flat. Maybe because sounds are important, right, in poetry, and even if it's a very mundane statement, maybe the sound of the word that they used in Korean is like completely delicious, but in English it just sounds really plain. Um, or not even unpoetic. And I found that happens pretty often. And hmm, yeah, no, I think there are things that are lost for sure in terms of sound. And I think there are some certain sentiments that are more pronounced in the original language in Korea because we bring context into our reading, right? And reading it from the Korean context and knowing like some histories around maybe um, the creation of this poem, it it changes things. But if I put it into English, that context kind of disappears, and you can't always rely on readers to feel the responsibility to look up the paratextual things. So that's definitely a shame. But it still has to stand on its own as a poem and on the level of language. So I need to sometimes make some compromises.
Do any examples come to mind of a place where you felt you were really able more than usual to capture the feel of it of the Korean in your English translation?
Hmm. So I really like the translation that I did on page 19. It's a Kim Sonu poem called "Who Is That Asleep in My Body," and I put a little bit of a rhyme in there in that second stroke, days and ablaze, and I think it adds a kind of a like song-like quality. And in the Korean poem, there isn't like a rhyme or assonance or anything, but I put it in there to reflect the musicality that I felt in the original language. So, and of course, I didn't change any words really. I mean, instead of saying a flame, I use the blaze because of the light. But yeah, I really like that. I thought that it transfers this really beautiful quality of the Korean poem. So yeah, I'm proud of that one. And there were some other things. I need to look through it to tell you the exact ones. But yeah, sometimes there are things that just work out. You know, that's a really amazing moment. Um, actually, the poem "Mother Standing Outside the Door" on page 30 to 31 by Kim Seung-hee. It it's a really heartbreaking poem. For those who haven't read it, it's the poem talks about a woman in Korea who was basically killed, right, by this American private Michael, and who stuck a Coca-Cola bottle into her vagina, right, in the poem. And I was I was struck because I used the word private, right, to describe her vagina. But then before that, there was also private Michael. So there was like these two things kind of overlapping. That was kind of an accident in the poem, because in Korean, private Michael, that private is not the same as the word private in Korean. So it was an accident, but I liked how it's repeating. Right? This really awful fact that happened is repeating, and that painfulness comes through, I think, through that repetition, even though contextually, like a non-Korean person might not have gotten it going into the poem. So yeah, there are sometimes things like that just happen, and it's definitely a gain rather than a loss in that translational process.
That example of well, it's a pun. I guess I don't usually, I think of puns as more playful,
Mm-hmm.
but the double meaning of private.
Yeah, no, it's terrible, right? It's kind of a
Yeah.
terrible accident in translation, but for this poem, it's it works, I think. Yeah, it's really emphasized like this terrible murder.
And that might be the answer to my next question. So if it is, you can just say that, and I'll ask you the next question. But I was wondering if you would find an example of a place where you felt you took the most poetic license, right, the furthest from the Korean in your translation. So kind of the inverse of my earlier question of where you felt you really captured the.
Hmm. Um, I think I tried not to change too much. Um, I think for fiction there is more room to do that. I mean, I don't want to like speak for everybody because I'm sure every translator has a different philosophy, right? But for poetry, because I feel like it's such a compact space, I didn't want to really add anything or change the diction at all. But I'm sure there were parts, when I decided like instead of using this grammatical structure, I should use this or something like that. So I think on any license that I took was maybe on that level. I'm trying to think. Mm, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's one particular one. I'll have to get back to you on that. But that's kind of interesting to think about, like which poems I did that with and which poems I didn't really have to
Right.
think too creatively about, if that sounds not too flippant. But yeah.
Sadly, contemporary Korean poetry is not read very much in the U.S., and hopefully your work will help change that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
I'm curious about English poetry, either in English or in translation, in in Korea, or read by Korean language poets.
Mm.
Basically, I'm wondering, is Korean poetry and English poetry, are they in conversation with each other as traditions, or are they just kind of developing in side by side but separate?
Well, yeah, actually, in colonial Korea, translation was really important to the creation of vernacular poetry. So they, like the poets in Korea, would read a lot of English poetry in translation, Japanese poetry in translation, and crafted their own um, voice, own style in Korean. Because before the colonial period, all the poems are written in Chinese characters, right? But in the colonial period, people started using the Korean alphabet. And translation had a big part in shaping that poetic practice. And nowadays, I'm thinking about who's read in Korea a lot, and of course, people like really widely canonized poets like Shakespeare. Um, I don't know. I don't know who else is read a lot, but just like canonized modern English poets, I'm sure are always in the bookstores. In terms of contemporary poets, I don't think there are many translations, but I do know that this Korean poet Kim Dum, who's also included in this chapbook, she I think is or has started a magazine that translates Korean American poets and introduces them to Korean readers. So I think there are conversations happening, and in academia, I see Korean scholars engaging with Korean American poetry, like Youngmin Kim especially, and Teresa Huckenshaw, of course. But yeah, in terms of just normal people, I don't know if many people have really encountered um, contemporary English language poetry. And I do know in the US, Kim Yoon has done very, very well. She's the first person in this chapbook, and a lot of her collections have been translated by poet um, Jungmin Choi. And I think they just finished their Europe tour to launch Autobiography of Death, which has been translated recently and was nominated, I think, shortlisted for the Griffin Poetry Prize. So yeah, she's been getting a lot of attention, and I think her popularity in the poetry community in the U.S. has led to other translation projects to happen. And I know this modern poet Isang, his name is Isang, and his like a collected no like a complete collection of his works, like his poems, his prose, like critical and fiction writings are being translated and it's going to be published by Wave Books. So yeah, there are things happening. It's really encouraging.
That is encouraging. I think my favorite poem in the book is probably Poetry by Choi Young Mi on page 15 and 16. So the poet or the speaker's poem wakes up early in the morning and hears their mother already awake in the kitchen cooking,
Right.
kind of reflects on the kind of the relationship or the parallels between poetry and cooking.
Mm.
I don't have a specific question about this. I wonder if you just might talk to us a little bit about this poem.
Yeah, no, I really like that poem, and I knew that I wanted to include a poem that's about mothering or about mothers in here, in addition to this. Oh, you just popped. Is this okay?
Say that again?
Sorry, the camera just paused on my.
Yeah, it paused, but it's running again now.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and I love this poem because it's, you know, comparing the mother like chopping kimchi as like a poetic movement, right? And really honoring this morning ritual. But also there's a little bit of shame, right, of the daughter not doing anything, but just lying there listening to the mother cutting the kimchi and writing about it. That I thought was really tender. And just like she's lying there thinking about her mother's life, and how her mother will probably die just doing this every morning, chopping kimchi, and she feels somewhat shameful and sad about that. But this poem is um, remembering this, right? The mother will always be chopping kimchi, and maybe this it wasn't her choice. Maybe it's not her favorite thing to do, but that's what the author remembers of the mother, and it's like a really tender moment they share when they're both awake, but maybe not aware of each other's um, presence. So yeah, no, I really love this poem, and I really like this part in which she writes. She compares the fine chopping of the kimchi to the precision of her clock hands, that I thought was great, and you know, really speaking to not knowing how much time passes when she's just listening to this like knife hitting the cutting board, and this sense of eternality created in that moment. So yeah, I'm glad you like that poem as well.
I love everything that you just said about it. I can understand, especially the kind of the tenderness of that moment. And the last words of the poem are, "I wove a single poem, a strand of shame."
Mhm.
You just talked about how she's feeling shame. What is she feeling shame about? What
Mm,
get the tenderness, but I guess I don't fully understand the shame.
yeah, I mean, it's not altogether clear, right? I think it could be read in multiple ways. Like maybe she feels ashamed that she's so lazy, lying in the comforter while the mother's up early in the morning, chopping kimchi, like getting ready for the day. Or maybe she feels even ashamed that the mother became a mother, right? Because of her existence, that she lived this life like early morning, like chopping kimchi, like getting ready for the day for like everyone kind of life. And I mean, as a daughter, I can kind of empathize with that if that is the interpretation that we're going with. You know, like thinking about what all mothers have to sacrifice and give up, right, when they become mothers, and really honoring that, but also feeling thankful and a little bit ashamed at the same time, right? Like my existence in the world has brought to them, and I'm sure there's, you know, joy and happiness, but inevitably for women, you know, the social pressures of being a mother is so great that it cannot not affect that. Right? So
Another poem I want to ask you about, by Shin Hyun Rim, deals with, titled "Abortion."
right.
And reading this poem in the U.S. in 2019, I can't help but kind of read it in the context of
Mm,
just the painful, polarized, simplistic debates that are happening in this country. Debates in which it seems to me so few people ever actually consider the experience of those who have had an abortion. Uh,
mm,
which makes me think that a poem like this is so important for us to
mm,
read for that reason.
right.
But I'm also struck by how readers who come to the poem within their mind, the debates in the U.S. might find a contradiction. I don't think it necessarily is a contradiction,
Mm,
but that if you come to it from that perspective,
mm.
which is that on one hand, the poem stresses the speaker's choice to have the abortion. But on the other hand, the poem also stresses kind of the life of the fetus. So it's not a poem that would fit in any neat political position in the U.S. So I'm wondering if you might talk about that, comment on the poem, and perhaps what are the politics of abortion in Korea compared to the U.S. that might shed light at the poem?
Yeah, no, I think that's important. Like in Korea, abortion is also not something that you should tell anybody about. You know, it's very shameful and sinful even. And I've seen very many like ugly discussions around abortion and women's choice, as if it's the woman's fault, right? And yeah, now that you say it, I think it could be problematic. Really treating a fetus like it's a life, maybe a life that's more important than the woman's life. I think this poem is being honest though about how this person personally felt about going through with this abortion. It's not an easy choice, right? It's something that people choose to do for many many reasons, but it's not like taking off a sweater. And I think this speaker um, was feeling really emotional about it. I mean, she chose to do it, right? But she cannot help but think of the life that it could have become, like the baby that it could have become, and that she had a decision in stopping that from happening. So I think she is really open about that shame and honest about how she was viewing this fetus. So yeah, but now that you say it, that does add some more complicated dimensions to the reading of this poem for sure.
Yeah, I think, well, exactly what you said, that this is the speaker or the poet's experience, and
Yeah.
that I think it's so important that whatever that experience be, we should be able to share that,
Mm.
and we be able to hear that and listen.
Yeah, and I think she was being totally brave just to even write about this topic because, again, in Korea, it's not something, if you went through the divorce, not a divorce, abortion, it's not something that you really tell anyone. And she wrote this for the whole world to read, right? And she's still being really honest about her vulnerabilities around this decision. So, yeah, it was a hard poem to really read
Yeah,
again and again as I translated it.
thank you. I have just a couple more questions for you. Um, I teach a world literature course, and we focus mostly on contemporary texts.
Right.
Everything that we read is either written in English or
Mm-hmm.
translated into English. And we read works from all over the globe, especially outside of the West.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, what advice would you have for my students? What would you tell my students, about reading across these cultural boundaries, whether that's historical or linguistic or national, where you're the reader is in one context and the text is coming from somewhere.
Yeah.
What might you tell them about that? And then about reading contemporary Korean poetry in particular.
So, well, I'm glad you're teaching that class and that it exists. I guess I would really emphasize that for me, the power of literature lies in its ability to grow empathy. Right? Reading about experiences that are not yours, that will never be yours. Maybe it's not of your historical time, but feeling empathetic for things that have happened, and also knowing that your personal history or your history in a certain nation, it's not just found. in the national category or your cultural category, but it's part of world history, right? What the U.S. did in other parts of the world, that's part of your history too. And so I think, a course like that is really wonderful because it teaches them that, everything that has happened around the world is part of their lives, right? And that you're living these histories and things that have happened in the past, like for example, the comfort women history in South Korea or the Korean Peninsula and other parts of East Asia. It's not something that's happened in the past and we don't have to care about anymore. But it's an unresolved issue. It's an issue that we're still living today. So it makes us really question what is the empire capable of? What what does the empire look like today? So it's not empire in the sense, it's not the British Empire or the Japanese Empire because they don't exist anymore, but what other shapes of empire exist today and how does that affect us? So yeah, I think reading world literature is important in really fostering these productive struggles with our position in the world. And about reading Korean poetry, I would say there are avenues in which we can find them. It's not always easy, right? Because, like you said, like a lot of people are not familiar with translated literature, especially things like Korean literature. But there are outlets. For example, there is Korean Literature Now, which is a magazine, like a print magazine, but they also have a website, and it's all free. If you register and make an account, you can access everything on the site. I think the subscription might be free as well. But there you can encounter a lot of contemporary works. I think they cover really important issues, what's hot in the discourse now. And there are a lot of modern Korean poems that have been translated and anthologized. There's Columbia University anthology of like modern Korean poetry or modern Korean fiction. So there are places to look. Um, yeah, it's not always intuitive, but if anyone's interested in your class, so you can let them know. I can be a resource. So they can email me through my UChicago email, which is Googleable. So yeah.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I have so enjoyed your book and talking with you about it. The last thing I want to ask you is just whether there's anything I haven't asked you about that you would like to say.
I don't think so. I mean, those you had really thoughtful questions. That made me consider my choices in translation a lot deeper, and I'm really glad that you even invited me to speak with you. I haven't been able to take a lot of time like promoting this or reading from this book the past few months. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity to talk about translation and this book. Oh, I guess the question could have been, how do you buy this? um, it's I think it is only available on the Tilted Axis website, right? Yeah, it's only £7, 7 British pounds. Um, but I think shipping costs like £5 or something. So if speaking to the hypothetical audience, if you're interested in this book, get some friends to order it with you. So you can save on
That's a
shipping.
great idea, and it'll be well worth it.
Yeah, I hope so. And try the other books in the series as well. They're all very good, so I recommend them.
Well, wonderful. Well, Emily, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, so long.
Yeah, bye.